I don't know if you've read this section of my book yet, but
I just got it tonight.
Good.
I've heard many of your stories over the years.
Right.
And I was always fascinated by what the Native Americans had to say about George Washington.
Correct. And I have the entire story about that, which is called the Indian Prophecy. And the story is unbelievable because it's very complicated. Our source for the Indian Prophecy is Dr. Craig, who was a lifelong friend of Washington's and who was an eyewitness to this story. The story is that apparently Washington went out before the Revolution. It was about 8 years after the Battle of Monongahela, which is also known as Braddock's Defeat, which is one of the worst days in the history of the British Army, where basically they marched into a trap along a road that they were trying to build and marching very slowly with heavy equipment. And the woods were filled with French sharpshooters and their Native American allies, some of them Native Canadian allies. And they shot at the British. There were 70 officers on horseback, British officers and American militia officers. 69 of them were either killed or seriously wounded. Only one of them was not harmed. His name was Washington. He was a 23-year-old lieutenant colonel and of the militia. And Washington was a big, juicy target. He was 6'3". At a time when the typical American, the typical person was 5'6". He stood out. He had two mounts shot out from under him. And basically to survive after your horse is shot and falls and you fall and the chances of breaking a leg, he survived. He showed his clothes after the battle. There were 4 bullet holes in his clothing, including his hat was shot off from his head. Okay, and this was so striking at the time that Samuel Davies, a famous pastor, and this is the very end of 1755, long before the Revolution, Washington's 23, that Samuel Davies, future president of Princeton University, famous pastor, delivers a sermon and says that surely Providence has protected that magnificent youth, Colonel Washington, and sustained him for some singular service to his people. Okay, this is pretty striking, yeah. Now, it gets more. And the chapter about George Washington is entitled Indestructible, Indispensable. And he was. At many, many points, you can see the entire history of the world being changed if bullets go a little bit this way, a little bit that way. Washington, before this Battle of Monongahela, he was coming back from having delivered an ultimatum to the French, and he had all of these adventures which I describe based upon his own recollections and the recollections of his companions. He had 2 companions, 1 companion for part of the journey and 2 companions for part of it. At one point, they were thrown into the ice, and he miraculously survived. And this is in December, and it's in a river in western Pennsylvania, and it's cold. And they survived. But they were fording the river with rafts that they had created, and an ice floe came and knocked them in. And at one point, an Indian came out of the woods and offered to help them and to guide them, and saw that Washington's companion was carrying a heavy musket, and the Indian offered, "Oh, I'd be very glad to carry your musket for you," and took the musket, and then immediately took aim at Washington and fired at him from, they think, about 10 feet away. It was close. And as I say in the book, at this moment, if someone were making a movie about this, and they should, you would see the bullet in slow motion as the entire history of the world depends upon this bullet missing its great big 6'3" target, and it did. And it goes on. During the Revolution, it was well known that Washington could not be shot. He rode at the lead of his troops at the Battle of Monmouth. They were shooting at him. Patrick Ferguson, who was the most famous marksman in the British Army, had a chance to plug Washington from a nest of snipers before the Battle of Brandywine, but for inexplicable reasons said that felt distasteful to him and didn't want to do it. So yeah, the Indian prophecy. This guy, Dr. Craig, shared an account with the closest thing to a descendant that George Washington had. His name was Custis, and Washington never had children. This is another thing that you think about. Isn't that strange, the father of our country? Right? And the reason that people believed, and I believe, that Washington, I am just as much a descendant of George Washington as anybody. So are you, so are you, so are you, so is everybody. Because he never had children of his own. He did have a stepchild. He had 2 stepchildren. And he had step-grandchildren because Martha was a widow when he married Martha. And one of his step-grandchildren wrote this play and wrote out the Indian prophecy. And this is Washington is going together with his friend Dr. Craig. They're going for an expedition in the woods. And an Indian comes out of the woods with a whole group of people. He's an aged chief. And he says he came here because he wanted to meet the great chief, the tall one. That would be Washington. And then he tells this story from an Indian point of view, which is in the book as it was transcribed by Washington's step-grandson, about the Indians concluding their bullets were useless against this one. That on that day, the day of the great battle, they couldn't miss, but they were powerless against George Washington. It's spooky stuff, and it struck people at the time. It should strike us today.